right, hello and welcome to the show. It's Mystery Go and the Feral Monk. This is season 2. Thank you to all the new subscribers and listeners out there. Just want to let you guys know that we've started off this season talking about yoga, and the first episode was kind of an introduction to yoga, where Mr. Monk gave us a lot of great insight into his experiences and the wisdom that he has accumulated over the past 26 years on the subject. So we're basically referencing Patanjali's Yoga Sutras as a framework because it's one of the probably the most referenced yogic text that's used in modern yoga today. So with that being said, I'm going to put myself on the spot and see if I can rattle off the 5 yamas for everyone. That's what this episode is going to be based on. So the first one is ahimsa. The second one is satya. The third one is asteya. The fourth one is brahmacharya. And the fifth one's aparigraha. Excuse my mispronunciations if I butchered those, but I'm still learning. But so starting off with ahimsa, I guess from what I've learned so far, it means nonviolence. You want to elaborate on that some, Mr. Monk?
I can jump right into ahimsa. I'd like to also just mention really quick that in that first episode, we really did sort of like just a super fast flyby of sort of like the typical types of modern yogas that you're likely to encounter as a new student. And most of those are going to reference Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which is actually the Patanjala Yoga Shastra, is like its name. We call it the Yoga Sutras. And that way we're kind of staying in the context of what most people are going to be practicing today and what they're going to hear most often in their yoga classes. What are they going to experience as the quote unquote teachings of yoga tradition are probably going to be in one way or another referring back to Patanjali. So it makes sense to open a discussion on yoga, especially in the modern day, with his sutras. And his system, although he goes in a different order in how he orders out his text, he actually begins with samadhi, the samadhi pada, and then he moves on to the sadhana pada. And the sadhana pada is more of like the practice or the practicality of going through the process, the yoga process, even though it's not really a yoga process. But for the sake of easy communication, we're just going to use colloquialisms like that. And so in that system of 8 limbs, Yama is going to be the first limb. And Yama might sound, somewhat familiar to most of you in the word pranayama. And in that word, it's, as we talked about in the first episode or in the last episode, it can be seen as pranayama or pranayama. But either way, yama, this word's in there, and it's also the title of this first limb, and so it has a lot to do with discipline. So we are, basically in the yamas, we are exploring the necessary disciplines.
I've seen it referred to as observances.
They get in these interesting. Because you have the yamas and the niyamas. Yes. The niyamas being the second limb. And so sometimes they'll call them like practices and observances, or they'll split them off into 2 different ways to say, something, because they're trying to translate these words, why does Patanjali use yama and niyama? And it's a nice debate for the yogic scholarly world to kind of fight it out amongst themselves of what they imagine to have been met. But for us as practitioners, what's really interesting is like, okay, what we're talking about here are basically certain types of disciplines or certain types of like basics, like that first rung, things that you need to take care of early on in your practice.
Right.
And that could be, you hear sentences like in the older texts and stuff that if you don't practice the yamas and the niyamas, and you move on into the more advanced practices of yoga, then you'll end up in a disaster. It'll be, disastrous or catastrophic, or some terrible thing will befall you or whatever. And I think that comes from more of the idea of, think about somebody who develops a great deep understanding about human psychology and stuff like that, but they don't have any ethical background to guide their actions in that realm. So maybe without those guides, they might then manipulate people into doing very terrible things. Yes. Because they don't have that base. So they don't have that. They've progressed in certain types of knowledge, but they never took care of their ethical foundation. And so these kinds of disciplines of the yamas are kind of moving towards that. In a conversation we were talking about, you mentioned that you thought that they might be looked at through the lens of components of the mastery of self, like things that you need to master in order to have self-mastery. And that was a very interesting conversation we had. I don't know if you remember or not, or if you'd like to touch on that question.
Yeah, I think that it seems to provide that kind of framework and structure for living a good, sound, moral life. And I'm sure that all the religions, kind of have their version of the yamas. I would say maybe in Christianity, it's like what, the 10 Commandments or something like that. And so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what, it hearkened when I first learned of them, was that it was just ancient wisdom. But yeah, if used correctly, I think what they're saying, by like observing yourself and then using discipline, then yeah, you can achieve some kind of self-mastery. I think that's important, and it's, totally applicable to all times, but especially now in our current lives, with the state of affairs, not being so reactive, and just being conscious and aware of everything that we do, say. Yeah, we can all probably improve upon those things.
Yeah, it might be interesting then to think about, like, in this idea of self-mastery. I think that really, is putting your finger on something about sort of a common thread through the yogas all the way through to today. Is there's this, it comes along with this idea of self-mastery. And so you're trying to master these different aspects of yourself. I don't know if I would call them be able to control them, but maybe by the end of it, samadhi allows like a huge amount of freedom that allows you to more play with them instead of be dominant. But along the beginning of the path, it's a great thing to develop a lot of willpower. Yoga coming from like the more ascetic traditions of India, of people going out into the forest and searching these things out on their own and testing things out and trying out techniques and communicating between groups and developing. There's a long tradition of this idea of self-mastery. Sometimes it comes in more of the idea of penance, of like paying for your bad deeds or your past karma or things like that. And sometimes it's more in the cultivating sense of like cultivating positive attributes and then bringing that into the world. So it can be really diverse. But that whole that whole outlook of self mastery as being something very important, I think is absolutely hitting the nail on the head. So if we think of, like, for example, you took ahimsa, and so we might then ask ourselves, okay, then how is ahimsa helping me to master myself?
Mm-hmm.
And what would be your, for example, what would be your response to how ahimsa might be helping us to master ourselves?
Yeah, well, I believe that it's all about nonviolence, and that's not only in the physical sense of the word. It's also talking about your actions and I mean your words that you speak. Um, and so, yeah, I think I struggle with that one probably the most of the five. At least it seems like it in my mind, um, because there's also you know satya, and they kind of go hand in hand with truthfulness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So saying things that you think are true may not be the wisest way to go about certain maybe
Yeah, I know the
interactions and
dilemma you're.
conversations.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I struggle with that. And so ahimsa, I don't know. I feel like it's almost a suppression of anger, and sometimes anger can be a good thing, if we're in a bad situation, and you know, we need to feel some anger. It's in our DNA, whatever.
Yeah.
So I struggle with the ahimsa. That's what I think about
Yeah.
it. I don't really know.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's something that everyone at least struggles with at the subtle level of the mind, where we imagine violent actions against people we have perceived them as wronging us, or something in some way. I think that's a absolutely natural reaction that probably has a momentum that carries long into the future. Um, uh, I would. I would say that because it's from an ascetic tradition, a lot of these things, these disciplines, and just like, we'll get into in the next episode with the niyamas, with tapas, with tapasya, and the ascetic tradition of these, like, um, laborious, difficult penances to try to burn up their karma, where a lot of, like, the hatha yoga actually ends up developing out of sort of that stream. We'll sort of see that, like, a lot of times there was also a different view about why you would want to do that. So they're in the forest, engaged in these deep spiritual practices. So ahimsa is teaching you to master yourself in the sense that you're mastering your anger. It doesn't mean that you're never using it. There's going to be moments where you're going to need to use it, right? But you're
Right.
mastering yourself, you're mastering your anger, and you're mastering your reactions,
Hmm.
especially your emotional reactions.
Yes.
And so that's one of the ways that it's, like, affecting the development of our self-mastery. um, it's also the idea, because it comes from this ascetic, almost magical, shamanic warrior tradition, that if you can practice perfect ahimsa, then nobody can be violent within your presence, which means that, even living in the forest or whatever, tigers or other predator animals are not going to attack you or bother you. And in the sense of being in a public place, other people are not even going to be able to be violent against each other anywhere around you. So
Wow.
that's the idea that it's coming from.
It's not only
Uh,
like a shield, but it's like a
a
positive bubble.
blessing.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a blessing, a positive bubble of energy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Wow.
a little bit the original intention from it.
It's
So
beautiful.
then, so satya,
Hmm.
you said, coming next. So what would truthfulness and honesty, and what is that helping us to master in ourselves?
Um, I mean, it's kind of, I guess, maybe to do with karma, a little bit, but yeah, just being authentic and genuine. Not being, dishonest, not claiming to be someone you're not blowing smoke up someone's ass, those things.
Yeah.
Keeping it real a little bit, but you don't have to keep it real all the time.
So it's mastering
about, when keeping it real goes wrong. It can.
Yeah, but it's also helping us to like master that impulse to manipulate the way other people view us, sort of to manage our portfolio of personality, to like manipulate the way the other people view us, to manipulate circumstances to our benefit, to get out of situations where we might have accrued blame for something rightfully.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of facing it and owning up to it, we tend to, slime away in some way, by turning the guilt around on someone else, or going to a pity story or a poor me situation, all like sort of strategies, ego strategies, it's self-preservation. And
yes,
and so it's helping to master that tendency to do that, to give a shit about all of that. It's helping us get a little bit of mastery over that, and truthfulness in that same way we were talking about in the ascetic viewpoint. Speaking the truth depends on like legends and things, but like speaking the truth, say for 12 years straight, might afford the yogi the ability to that whatever he says comes true.
Right.
That he becomes able, if he's keeping all of his yamas and his practices, and he's become this extremely, purified soul, I guess you could say, although that can have connotations of arrogance and things to it, but like a real one, somebody who was really genuine about it might get to a level of energy that then whatever they would speak would actually come to be.
I wonder if that's where genies came from.
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting idea.
Yogi in a lamp. Anyway, so yeah, that's so fascinating. Like that instant manifestation, having that such crazy. It doesn't seem that far fetched to just like it. Like I'm not saying it couldn't happen. Of course, I think it could happen, but I think it's very maybe hard.
It's out there.
Very hard.
It's fun. It's out there, but it's fun.
Yeah.
There's a great book called I think it's Deva Bhumi, and that's if anyone's just looking for random interesting books about Himalayan yogi saints doing miracles. It's a pretty interesting book to read.
All right, Asteya is next.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna run through these fast. What do you think? What's Asteya?
In mastering ourselves, it's mastering that impulse to want to take, to take things that don't already ours. Yeah, there's this amount of greed to it, which shows up also in Aparigraha. There's definitely this element of greed to it. Aparigraha is more of the clinging, like
Okay, so
like holding on to it.
Okay, yeah, the Asteya is the non-stealing.
Is non-stealing, yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right.
So it's also like not taking things that don't belong to you. It can develop into the extremes of like also not accepting gifts. Also in the ascetic sense of not entangling in new karmas,
and then brahmacharya is basically kind of a moderation of the senses.
That would be probably the most typical way of of saying that. It's a bit of a modern cop out. You could talk for a while on brahmacharya,
but back in the day, it was very much a celibacy right?
It has like different stages of, I wouldn't say meaning, like implication, maybe, so like in the modern sense, we got brahmacharya from a time that used it as meaning celibate. So it meant like, sexual restraint,
Yes. Yes.
and um,
Conserving energy.
yeah, and people in the modern age don't like that. They're like, no, I want to have sex, dog.
Mhm.
I'm not trying to.
Which is in
I'm not
contrast.
trying to live like a completely flat life,
Which is in
Uh,
contrast to what everyone's idea of like tantric yoga would be, right? You know,
almost all of the hatha postures are tantric yogic developments,
right.
starting with a tantric Buddhist text from like the 10th century.
It's fascinating.
It's crazy. So I mean, tantra isn't just about sex. It's a certain philosophical development and a
Yes.
certain outlook on things, and there are as many tantric traditions in both Buddhism and Hinduism and
Very,
Jainism.
very much more on the left hand of the yoga spectrum is what you would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Whenever you cut it down to like the super short answer, the CNN length answer, where they're just giving you yes or no questions.
Yeah.
And there's always room in yoga to like open up and unpack everything and go further and further and further into it. And some of those efforts are really rewarding and can like make you feel like, okay, that's nice. And sometimes those efforts can just end up filling your head with a whole bunch of stuff that isn't really going to help you achieve, the realization of your soul and
that's what
and
it's
the
all
ability
about.
the ability to live from that space of consciousness. So, but they're fun.
So,
So brahmacharya, you could break down. You could say you have Brahma as a word, and you have Charya as a word.
mm-hmm.
And Brahma would be, something synonymous with God, but it's also in the Vedantic tradition, it's synonymous with the self, with the soul, being in the end only one thing, so there's a very monistic background to that idea, that in the end it's all just God, we're just God having an experience of his beautifully creative imagination, through us as
Yes.
particular roles, the Leela, so to speak.
Yes.
It's a nice thing to go into at some point.
Bhagavad Gita is the song of God, right?
Yeah. And so you would have this like this idea of God, this very monistic, almost like extreme monotheistic viewpoint of God, and that would also be synonymous with your innermost self. And so brahmacharya, and charya is to follow. So it would be something like to follow your inmost self, which is also God, or to follow God, or to be true to yourself, or, that would be like if you're going to play with the word and the definitions and try to see something in it, that's a good thing to see in it, is that's actually the root of the words itself. At some point, we're talking about ascetic traditions, we're talking about, yogic traditions that are going towards discipline. So at some point that is going to be developed and come to mean sort of a celibate, withdrawn life, but like celibate to like everything, like celibate almost to the world itself.
Yes.
All
right, so let's wrap this up. Number 5 is aparigraha, and that I think is like greedlessness. We touched on, or because I confused it with asteya earlier. I don't know a whole lot about aparigraha as far as it pertains to mastering oneself.
Yeah, I mean it's the same thing with all those words, right? So you got like aparigraha, asteya, ahimsa. So you've got all of these different things with and so it just means there's like a no to it. It's a non thing. So in this particular sense, it has to do with non-clinging, just not holding on to
Okay.
things, the ability to be able to let things go, to be able to not cling like with
Not a mass
like in the
things, kind of.
yeah, and in the Buddhist sense also of like not clinging, like just not clinging on to things and like, oh, I need that, and that's important
Mine.
to
Yeah.
and all. So
Yeah.
parigraha has mostly to do with that, like eliminating this attitude, mastering this part of yourself that is kind of greedy and clingy and wanty
Possessive and
because it'll mess up your ride as a human being too.
yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, that's awesome. So yeah, basically that's great. Way to just kind of segue in now to the next episode. We're going to be talking about the niyamas. Basically going into those, and that'll be exploring, I guess, a lot of the tapas, right, Mr. Monk?
Yeah, well, tapas would be one of the niyamas.
Okay, right. There'll be some good chatter and conversation there over that. Looking forward to it. I want to thank everyone for listening in, and once again, please like and hit that subscribe button and share with all your friends and family who like yoga. And we appreciate all the support. Thank you again, Mr. Monk, for joining.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Always. Mystery Go out.